Thank you for returning for the second part of Down Styphon by H. Beam Piper. It came to a little over that, but not much. 2,500 regular infantry, meaning organized into something like companies and given a modicum of drill, 1,000 arquebusiers and calivermen, with 1,500 pikemen to keep the cavalry off them. 2,000 militia, peasant levies, anybody who could do an hour's foot drill without dropping dead, armed with anything at all, and slightly less than 1,000 cavalry, with steel cuirasses, helmets, and thigh guards. And against that, Prince Gormoth had 4,000 of his own subjects, including neither the senile nor the adolescent, and none of them armed with bows or agricultural implements, and 6,000 mercenaries, of whom 4,000 were cavalry. "Then we'll just have to be able to move what men we have around faster," Rila said. Well, good girl. She'd grasped what neither her father nor Harmacross had, that mobility can make up for a numerical inferiority. Yes, Harmacross, how many horses can you find to mount our infantry? They don't have to be good horses, just good enough to get the men where they can fight on foot. Harmacross was scandalized. Mounted soldiers were cavalry. Anybody ought to know it took years to train a cavalryman. So was Styphon. Infantry were foot soldiers and had no business on horseback. It'll mean 1 out of 4 holding horses in a battle, but they'll get to the battle before it's over and they can wear heavier armor. Now, how many infantry can we mount? Harmacross looked at him, decided that he was serious, and was silent for a while. It always took Harmacross a little to recover from the shock of a new idea. Then he grinned and nodded. "I'll find out," he said, grabbing the remount officer by the arm and pulling him off to the side. Rilla joined them with a slate and a piece of soapstone. Rilla was the math wizard. She'd learned how to do up to long division in Arabic numeration. While they argued, he began talking to Tosphes and Styphon about artillery. That was the one really hopeful thing about the situation. Here and now, cannon didn't have trunnions. The guns were bedded into timbers like huge gunstocks or timber frames for the heavier pieces. What passed for field artillery was mounted on 4-wheeled carts, usually ox-powered. He blamed Styphon's house for that. They did the weaponeering, and they didn't want bloody and destructive wars, which were bad for business, or decisive wars which established peace, which were worse. They wanted a lot of little wars all the time to burn a lot of fireseed. In the past 2 months, along with everything else, and by methods which would have made Simon Legree look like the model employer, he had ordered 6 new 4-pounders built with trunnions, on field carriages with limbers. Drawn by 4 horses apiece, they would keep up with cavalry on any sort of decent ground. He had also had trunnions welded onto some old pieces, mostly 8-pounders, and mounted them on makeshift field carriages. They would not keep up with cavalry, but they were 500% better than anything Gormoth had ever heard of. They were still talking when Harmacross and Rila came over. 2,000, Rila said. They all have 4 legs. We think they were all alive yesterday evening. We'll need some for pack train and replacements. 1,600 mounted infantry, 800 arquebusiers with arquebuses, not rabbit guns, and 800 pikemen with pikes, not hunting spears or those scythe-blade things. He turned to Styphon. Can you manage that? Styphon could. Men who wouldn't fall off their horses, too. And all the riflemen. 50 of them. All the muskets and calivers and arquebuses he'd been able to get rifled to date. That was 50 more than the combined rifle strength of all 5 great kingdoms. And 500 cavalry swords and pistols, no lances or musketoons. Everybody heard that, and everybody howled. There weren't that many, not uncommitted. Swords flashed over the map, pointing to places where there were only half enough now. One of these days, somebody was going to use a sword in one of these arguments for something beside map pointing. Finally, they scraped up 500 cavalry for the new mobile force. You'll command, he told Harmacross. You'll have all 6 4-pounders and the best 4/8s. You'll be based in Seven Hills Valley. Be ready at any notice to move either east or west from there. As soon as I get it organized, which will be tomorrow afternoon at latest, I'll be ready to go to Seven Hills. I can promise I'll be there by noon the next day. That meant he'd be there before that. That was another thing about Harmacross. Oh, and before I forget, he addressed them all. Battle cries. They had to be shouted constantly to keep from being killed by your friends. Beside Tosphes and Hostigos, we will also shout, "Down Styphon!" That met with general approval. They all knew who the real enemy was. Gormoth, Prince of Nostor, set down the goblet and wiped his bearded lips on the back of his hand. The candles in front of him and down the long tables to the side flickered slightly. Tableware clattered, voices were loud. "Lost everything!" The speaker was a baron driven from Seven Hills Valley when Tar Dombra had fallen. "My house, a score of farms, a village." "You think we've lost nothing? They crossed at Vrelos and burned everything on my land. It was a Styphon's miracle I got out at all." "For shame!" Viblos the high priest cried rebukingly. "What of the Seven Hills Temple Farm, a holy place pillaged and desecrated? What of the blood of 15 consecrated priests and novices and a score of lay guards, all cruelly murdered, dealt with as wolves are?" he quoted. "Well, we have an army." "Haven't we?" somebody at the side table on the left hectored. "Why don't we use it?" Weapons clattered outside, and somebody else sneered, "That's Tosphes now, under the tables, everybody!" A man in black leather entered, advancing and saluting, the captain of the dungeon guards. "Lord Prince," he said, "the special prisoner will tell all." "Ha!" He knew what that meant. Then he laughed at the anxious faces along the tables. Not a few of his nobles dreaded the thought that somebody was telling all about something. He drew his poniard and cut a line across the candle in front of him, a thumbnail's length from the top. "You bring good news. I'll hear him in that time." He nodded in dismissal. As the captain backed away, he rapped loudly on the table with the dagger pommel. "Be silent, all of you. I've little time, so give heed." He turned to Clestrus, the elected captain general of the mercenaries. "You have 4,000 horse, 2,000 foot, and 10 cannon. Add to them 1,000 of my infantry. Choose which you will, and such cannon of mine as you need. You'll cross the river at Marak's ford. Be on the road before the dew's off the grass tomorrow before dawn the next day. Take and hold the ford, put the best of your cavalry across, and let the others follow as speedily as they can. Netzigon," he addressed his own chief captain, "you'll gather every man you can, down to the very peasant rabble, and such cannon as Clestrius leaves you. With half of them, confront all the gaps into Nostor from Nearthe up. You'll take the others opposite Lystra Mouth and Vrelos Gap. As Clestrius moves west through Hostigos, he will attack each gap from behind. When he does, your men will cross the river and attack from the north. Dombra will have to starve out. The rest must be stormed. When Clestrius is back of Vrelos Gap, the force you have at Lystra Mouth will cross and move up Lystra Valley. After that, we'll have Tar Hostigos to take. Galzar only knows how long we'll be at that, but by the end of the moon half, all else in Hostigos should be ours." There was a gratified murmur along the tables. This made good hearing to all. Only the high priest Viblos was ill-pleased. "But why so soon, Prince?" "Soon," he roared. "By the mace of Galzar, you've been bawling for it like a weaned calf. Well, now you have your invasion. Thank your God for it." "A few more days would not be too much, Lord Prince," Viblos said mildly. "Today I had word from Styphon's house upon earth, from the pen of his divinity himself. An archpriest, His Holiness Krastokles, is coming here to Nostor, with rich gifts of fireseed and money, and the blessing of Styphon's voice. It were poor reverence not to await His Holiness coming." He turned to the two captains. "You heard me," he said. "I rule here, not the priest. Be about it. Send orders at once. You move tomorrow." Then he rose, pushing back his chair before the servant could withdraw it. The line was still visible at the top of the candle. Guards with torches attended him down the winding stairs into the dungeons. The air stank. His breath congealed. The heat of summer never penetrated here. From the torture chambers, shrieks told of some wretch being questioned. Idly he wondered who. Stopping at an iron-bound oaken door, he unlocked it with a key from his belt and entered alone, closing it behind him. The room within was large, warmed by a fire on the hearth in the corner, and lighted by a great lantern from above. Under it, a man bent over a littered table. He had a bald head and a straggling beard, and wore a most unprisoner-like dagger on his belt. A key for the door lay on the table, and a pair of heavy horseman's pistols. He straightened, turning. "Greetings, Prince. It's done. I tried it. It's as good as they make in Hostigos and better than the priest's trash. And no prayers to Styphon, Scranger?" he asked sarcastically. Scranger was chewing tobacco. He spat brownly on the floor. "In the face of Styphon, try it yourself, Prince. The pistols are empty." There was a dish half full of fire seed on the table. He measured in a charge, loaded and wadded a bullet on top of it, primed the pan and readied the striker, then fired into a billet of wood by the fire, and went to probe the hole with a straw. The bullet had gone in almost a little finger's length. Styphon's powder wouldn't do that. He carried the pistol back and laid it on the table. "Well, Scranger," he laughed, "you'll have to bide here a while, but from this hour you're first nobleman of Nostor after me. Style yourself Duke. There'll be rich lands for you in Hostigos when Hostigos is mine." "And the Styphon temple farm of Nostor," Scranger grinned. "If I'm to make your fire seed, there's all there that I'll need." "Yes, that too, by Galzar. After I've downed Tosphys, I'll deal with Viblus, and he'll envy Tosphys before I let him die." Snatching up a pewter cup without looking to see if it were clean, he went to the wine keg and drew for himself, tasted the wine, then spat it out. "Is this the swill they've given you?" he demanded. "By Galzar, whoever's at fault won't see tomorrow's sunset." He flung open the door and bellowed into the hall, "Wine! Wine for Prince Gormoth and Duke Scranger, and silver cups, and see it's fit for nobles to drink." Mobile Force HQ had been the mansion of an Astori noble driven from Seven Hills Valley on Defodombra Day. His name had been shouted ahead as he rode through the troop-crowded village, and Harmacross and his officers met him at the door. "Great Dralm Kalvan!" Harmacross laughed, clasping his hand. "Are you growing wings on horses now? Our messengers only got off an hour and a half ago." "I know. I met them back of Vrilos Gap." They crossed the outer hall and through the doorway to the big room beyond. "We got the news at Tar Hostigos just after dark. What have you heard since?" At least 50 candles burned in the great central chandelier. Evidently the cavalry had arrived here before the peasants and hadn't looted the place too destructively themselves. Harmacross led him to an inlaid table on which a map, scorched with hot needles on white deerskin, was spread. "We have reports from all the watchtowers along the mountain. They're too far back to see anything but dust, but the column's 3 miles long. First cavalry, then infantry, then wagons and guns, and then more infantry and cavalry. They halted at Nirfi at dusk and built hundreds of campfires. Whether they left them burning and marched on after dark, and how far ahead the cavalry are, we don't know. We expect them at Marak's Ford by dawn." We got a little more than that. The priest of Dralm at Nostor town got a messenger off a little after noon. It was dusk before he could get across the river. "Your columns commanded by Clestrus, 4,000 mercenary cavalry, 2,000 mercenary infantry, 1,000 of Gormoth's infantry, 15 guns, he didn't say what kind, and a wagon train that must be creaking with loot. At the same time, Netzigon's moving west, probably toward Lystra mouth, and we don't know what with. The messenger had to dodge his troops all the way up to Vrilos. Chartifon's going to Lystra mouth with what he can scrape up. Prince Tosphys is occupying Vrilos Gap." "That's it! A double attack," Harmacross said. "We can't help Chartifon, can we?" "We can help him by beating Clestrus." He got out his pipe. As soon as he had filled it, one of the officers provided a light. "Thank you. What have you done so far?" "I started my wagons and the 8-pounders down the main road. They'll stop just short of Fitra here," he pointed on the map, "and wait for us. As soon as I'm all collected, I'm taking the cavalry and mounted infantry and the 4-pounders down the back road. After we're on the main road, the wagons and the 8s will follow on. I have 200 militia, the usual odds and ends, marching with the wagons." That was smart. Puffing on his pipe, he looked at the map. The back road, adequate for horsemen and the 4-pounders, but not for wagons, followed the mountains and then bent south away from them to join the main valley road at the village of Fitra. Harmacross had started his slow stuff first and could overtake without being impeded by it, and he was waiting till he had all his striking force in hand and not dribbling it in to be chopped up by detail. "Where had you thought of fighting?" "Why, on the Aethon, of course." Harmacross was surprised that he should ask. Clestres will have some cavalry over before we get there. That can't be helped, but we'll wipe them out or chase them back and then defend the line of the river. He touched the Fitra road junction with his pipe stem. We fight here. But that's miles inside Hostigos, one of the officers cried. Maybe he owned an estate down there. We can't let them get that far. Lord Kalvan, Hammercross began stiffly. He was going to be insubordinate. He never bothered with titles otherwise. We must not give up 1 foot of ground. The honour of Hostigos forbids it. Here we are, back in the Middle Ages. He seemed to hear the voice of a history professor inside his head calling a roll of battles lost on points of honour. Mostly by the French. They'd been the worst, though not the only offenders. He decided to fly into a rage. To Styphon with that, he yelled, banging his fist on the table. Honour won't win this war, and real estate won't win this war. The only thing that'll win this war is killing Nostori. Now here, he continued quietly, the rage having served its purpose, is where we can kill the most of them and get the fewest of our own men killed doing it. Clestres will cross the Athan here at Marac's Ford. That would be a little below where he remembered Watsontown to have been. He'll rush his best cavalry ahead to secure the ford, and the rest of the cavalry will cross next. They'll want to get in on the best looting ahead of the infantry. They'll push ahead without waiting. By the time the infantry are over, they'll be stringing west in bunches. Now, that army Clestres has could walk all over us, if they were all together. But they won't be. And they'll be tired, and we'll have reached Fitra by daylight, have our position prepared, our men and horses will be rested, we'll even be able to give everybody a hot meal. And Clestres will be strung out for 10 miles by the time his advance elements come up to us. Now, what kind of troops have we east of here? 100 cavalry along the river, and 150 regular infantry, and about twice as many militia. About 500 militia and regulars at posts in the gaps. All right, get riders off at once, somebody who won't be argued with. Have all that force along the river move back, to Fitra if possible, and if not, they can reinforce the posts at the gaps. The gaps will have to look out for themselves, we can't help them. The cavalry will keep just in front of Clestres, skirmishing, but doing nothing to delay him. Hammercross looked at the map, thought for a little, and nodded. East Hostigos, he said, will be the graveyard of the Nostori. That was all right. That took care of the honour of Hostigos. Well, mercenaries from Hos Agris and Hos Temnos, anyhow. That reminded him of something. Who hired those mercenaries? Gormoth or Styphon's house? Why, Gormoth. The money came from Styphon's house, but the mercenaries contracted with Gormoth. They serve him. The reason I asked, the Reverend, what's his name in Nostor, included a bit of gossip in his message. It seems that this morning Gormoth had one of his under-stewards put to death, had a funnel forced into his mouth, and half a keg of wine poured into him. The wine was of inferior quality, and had been given to a prisoner whom Gormoth had commanded good treatment. One of the officers made a face. Sounds like Gormoth, he commented. Another laughed and said he could think of a few tavern-keepers in Hostigos town who deserved that. Who was the prisoner? Hammercross asked. Count Feblon? Oh, no. Feblon's out of favour, but he isn't a prisoner. You know this fellow. A greasy horse-trader named Scranger. Yes, he got caught in Hostigos during the Iron Curtain. Like Fifth Column, Iron Curtain was now part of the Hostigi vocabulary. Then he blinked. He was working in the fire-seed mill while he was here. You think he might be making fire-seed for Gormoth? He is if he's doing what I told him to. There was an outcry at that. He laughed. And if Gormoth begins making his own fire-seed, Styph's house will hear about it, and you know what'll happen then. That's why I asked about those mercenaries. I was wondering whether Gormoth would use them against Styphon's house, or Styphon's house against Gormoth. He shrugged. Not that it matters. If everybody does his job tomorrow, nobody'll use those mercenaries, except maybe us. That's another thing. We don't bother with Nostori prisoners, but take all the mercenaries who'll surrender. We may need them later. Dawn was only a pallor in the east, and the whitewashed walls were blurs under dark thatches, but the village of Fitra was awake, light pouring from open doors and a fire blazing on the small common. There was a crowd, villagers and cavalrymen who had ridden ahead. Behind him, Hoofs thudded and armour and equipment clattered. Away back, he could hear the 4-pounders thumping over the pole bridge at the mill. The shouting started, of course. "Lord Kalvan! Drum bless Lord Kalvan!" He was used to it now. It didn't give him the thrill it had at first. He had to make a speech, while orders were shouted and re-shouted to the rear, and men and horses got off to the sides of the road to make way for the guns. Then he and Harmacross and 4 or 5 of the officers turned left and cantered down the main road, reining in where it began to dip. The eastern pallor had become a bar of yellow light. The mountains of Hostigos were blackly plain on the left, and the jumble of ridges to the right were taking shape. Nearby trees began to detach themselves from the obscurity. In a few hours they'd all be down. He pointed to the right. "Send 200 cavalry around that ridge over there to where those 3 farms are clumped together," he told Harmacross. "They're not to make fires or let themselves be seen. They're to wait till we're engaged and the second mob of Nostori cavalry come up. Then they'll come out and hit them from the flank and rear." An officer galloped away to the rear to attend to it. The yellow light was spreading upward in the east. Only the largest and brightest stars were still visible. In front, the ground fell away into a little hollow, with a brook running through it to the left, to join a larger stream at the foot of the mountain, which rose steeply, then sloped up to the summit. On the right was broken ground, mostly wooded. A few trees around them, in the hollow, and on the slope beyond, open farmland in front. This couldn't have been better if he'd had Dralm created to order. The yellow light was past the zenith, and the eastern horizon was a dazzle. Harmacross squinted at it and said something about fighting with the sun in their eyes. "No such thing. It'll be overhead before they get here. Now, you go take a nap. I'll wake you in time to give me some sack time. As soon as the wagons get here, we'll give everybody a hot meal." An ox cart appeared on the brow of the little hill across the hollow, piled high, a woman and a boy trudging beside the team, and another woman and more children riding. Before they were down to where the road crossed the stream, a wagon was coming up. "Have them turned aside," he ordered. "Don't let them get into the village." This was only the start. There'd be a perfect stream of them before long. They couldn't be allowed on the main road past Fitra, not till the wagons and the 8-pounders got through. And use wagons for barricades, and the oxen to help drag trees. The village peasants were coming out now, leading 4 and 6 ox teams, chains dragging. Axes began thudding. One thing, if anybody was alive here then, this village wouldn't have to worry about winter firewood. More refugees were coming in, loud protests at being diverted and at the seizure of wagons and teams. The axemen were across the hollow now, and men shouted at straining oxen as trees were dragged in to build an abatis. He strained his eyes against the sunrise. He couldn't see any smoke, too far away. He was sure, though, that the mercenary cavalry was across the Athon, and they ought to be burning things. Pyromania was as fixed in the mercenary character as kleptomania. Of course, he could be misjudging here and now mercenaries. All he knew was what he'd learned reading Sir Charles Oman's History of the Art of War, when he should have been studying homiletics and scriptural exegesis and youth organization methods at college, but there were universal constants. One was that mercenary soldiers' hearts were full of larceny. Another was that they liked being alive to spend their loot. He was pretty confident of what Clestras's cavalry were doing down toward the river. The abatis began to take shape, trees dragged into line, the tops to the front, with spaces for 3 of the 4-pounders on either side of the road, and a barricade of peasants' wagons at either end. He rode forward a couple of times to get an enemy's eye view of it. He didn't want it to look too formidable. He made sure that none of the guns would be visible. Finally, he noticed smears of smoke against the horizon, maybe 5 or 6 miles down the valley. Clestrius's mercenaries weren't going to disappoint him after all. A company of regular infantry, 150, 3 pikes to 2 calivers, came up in good order. They'd marched all the way from the Athon, reported firing behind them, and were disgusted at marching away from it. He told them they'd get all the firing they wanted by noon, and to fall out and rest. A couple of 100 militia dribbled in, some with crossbows. There were a few more smokes in the east, but he still couldn't hear anything. At 7:30, the supply wagons and the 8-pounders and the 200 militia wagon guards came in from the west. That was good. The refugees, now a steady stream, could be sent on up the main road.